She hadn't eaten in 2 days, not because she couldn't afford food, because she had been so focused on staying alive, not physically, but in the way that matters when you know something dangerous and you're the only one who knows it, that eating had simply stopped feeling important. She was standing in a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a basket with 2 items in it, when her body made a decision her mind hadn't approved yet. She went down, and the man who caught her, the man whose hand stopped her from hitting the floor, was not supposed to be there. He did not go grocery shopping. He had people for that. He had people for everything, but he was there. And when he picked up the bag she dropped, something fell out. A piece of paper, old, folded many times, written in a handwriting he had spent 15 years recognizing, on maps that could destroy half the powerful people in the city. He knew that handwriting. He looked at the woman on the floor in front of him, and everything changed. She thought she was protecting a secret. She had no idea she was sitting on a bomb her father had spent 20 years building, and that she was the only person alive who could read the instructions.
Callum Reyes did not go grocery shopping. He had people for that. He had people for most things. That was the point of spending 11 years building a network, so that the ordinary parts of life could happen without him standing in a fluorescent-lit aisle on a Tuesday afternoon, reading the back of a cough medicine box, while a woman 2 rows over tried very hard not to collapse. He heard her before he saw her. Not a crash, just the sound of someone fighting the floor, shoes dragging on linoleum, a breath catching wrong, one hand grabbing a metal shelf and holding on like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Callum turned in under a second. She was in the bread aisle, gray sweater, hair pulled back fast, eyes fixed on a middle point in the air that was not actually anything. Her body had made a decision that her mind had not quite caught up to yet. He crossed the distance before she finished falling, one hand behind her back, one hand on her wrist. He lowered her to the floor slowly, the way you lower something you do not want to break. 2 people nearby stopped and stared. Callum said quietly and without looking at them, "She's fine. She just needs air." The tone did what it was supposed to do. They moved along. He knelt in front of her, waited. About 30 seconds passed. She opened her eyes. She looked at him, not panicked, not confused. She looked at him the way a person looks at a room when they need to account for everything in it before they move. Who, where, why. That was the first thing Callum noticed about her. A woman who wakes up after fainting, and her first response is assessment, not reaction. That kind of reflex is not natural. It gets built. "When did you last eat?" Callum asked. "That's not," she started. "Yesterday morning," he said. "Before that, 2 days ago." She looked at him steadily. "You don't know that. The basket you dropped has instant noodles and 1 can of soup. 2 items. For someone who came here because she had nothing left at home." A pause. She looked down at her own hands, then back at him, not softened, still measuring. "Can you stand?" he asked. "Yes." "Then stand. I'll walk you out." He bought her a chocolate bar at the register. Not because he was being kind exactly, because she had not eaten and she needed sugar in her blood before she walked back out into November, and he put it in her hand in a way that did not give her a reasonable way to refuse without making a scene. She accepted it without comment, which told him something too. They stood outside on West 35th. The wind was doing what Chicago wind does in November, which is everything it wants to. Nora ate the chocolate standing there on the sidewalk. "Thank you," she said. "I'm fine now." "I know," Callum said. She started to walk, stopped, turned back and looked at him with the expression of someone who has realized something a few seconds later than they wanted to. "You didn't ask my name," she said. "No. Most people would ask. Most people ask because they want the answer. I ask when I need it." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Nora." He said, "Callum." That was all. She walked. He watched until she turned the corner on South Halsted and was gone. He stood on the sidewalk for 10 more seconds. Then he made a call. While he waited for the line to connect, he thought about Edmund Voss. He had been thinking about Edmund Voss every day for 8 months. Since the night the phone call came. Since the night someone told him that Edmund was gone, that it looked like a robbery, that the police were already treating it as routine. Callum had known immediately it was not routine. Edmund Voss did not get robbed. Edmund Voss had spent 15 years being so careful about so many things that the idea of him dying in a random parking lot over nothing made no structural sense. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it are entirely different territories. Callum lived in that gap constantly. Edmund had a daughter. Callum knew this. He had known it for 15 years and had never once met her, because Edmund had made one condition very clear from the first month they worked together: keep her out of this, all of it, including the fact that this existed at all. Callum had respected that condition every day for 15 years. And then 3 weeks ago, a source he trusted had come to him with information that someone was watching a woman connected to Edmund's old work. The source did not have a name yet. Callum had been quietly trying to find out. Now he had a name. He had a name, a face, and something else. When he had picked up the canvas bag, she dropped. A piece of paper had slipped out. Old, folded many times, soft at the creases. He had started to hand it back, and then he had stopped. Because he knew that handwriting. He had looked at that handwriting on maps and documents and quarterly reports for 15 years. The slight leftward pull at the end of every capital letter. The way the number 7 always had a crossbar. Edmund Voss had a handwriting as distinctive as a fingerprint, and what Callum was holding was written in it. He had handed it back without saying a word. The phone connected. "I need everything on Nora Voss," Callum said. "Archive librarian, Hargrove Institute. Start tonight, quietly." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Nora got home to her apartment in Pilsen and stood at the kitchen counter eating the last of the chocolate bar. The apartment was small, clean, orderly in the way that comes not from preference but from discipline, from knowing exactly what you have and where it is when money is something you count carefully. On the kitchen table, an open envelope, Jake's tuition invoice, this month's portion. Beside it, a small notebook with expenses written in pencil, because pencil could be erased and adjusted and corrected, and nothing in Nora's budget was ever final until it absolutely had to be. On the wall, a large Chicago map, the commercial kind from a bookstore. But it had small pencil marks all over it, locations, dates, names she was not sure she had right yet. 8 months of quiet work that she had not shown anyone and had not stopped doing even on the days when it felt like pushing a door that was never going to open. The police had closed the file on Edmund Voss in 72 hours. Random robbery gone wrong. The detective had used those exact words. Nora had written them down. She had written down everything, because writing things down was how she processed them, and because if she ever did find the door that opened, she wanted to have her notes in order. Her father had not been robbed. Nothing was taken. He had been carrying his keys and a small notebook that night, and the notebook was never found at the scene, never found anywhere, and the detective had mentioned this once and then not again. She took the paper out of her coat pocket now, spread it flat on the kitchen table. This was the map she had found 3 days ago. A box of donated materials had come into the Hargrove Institute archive, papers from a demolished house in Hyde Park, routine donation, nothing flagged. She had processed the box herself on a Thursday evening and found this at the bottom. No label, no name, nothing to indicate who had put it there or why. But she knew the handwriting. She had known it her entire life. She sat down at the table and she read it. She could read it because her father had taught her this language when she was 9 years old. He called it the bedtime puzzle game. Every night for about 3 years, he drew a small map with symbols, and Nora had to decode what it meant. She had thought it was because he loved maps and wanted to share them with her. She had thought a lot of things that turned out to be preparation she did not know was preparation. The map was not geographic. It was a map of people, a network of connections between names and locations and dates, all of it encoded in geographic symbols she had spent 3 evenings translating. She had gotten most of it. 3 names she could read clearly. 2 she recognized. The third one she had stared at for a long time before she wrote it down in her notebook. Senator Harlan Mast, running for governor of Illinois, on every front page. Accountability starts here, was the slogan. Nora sat with that name in the quiet of her kitchen for a long time. She thought about the man in the grocery store, Callum. She thought about the way he had not asked her name, and the way he had known about the basket, and the way he had said, "I ask when I need it." She thought about her father, and the careful way he had lived, and the fact that his last notebook was missing from the scene. She got up, went to the wall map, and added a small pencil mark. Then she went to bed and did not sleep for most of the night. 2 days after the grocery store, Nora was walking home. Same route she took every day. Down through the small streets near the park, left at the corner with the blue awning, past the dry cleaner that had been there since before she was born. She knew this walk the way she knew the archive. Every variation registered automatically. The man in the gray jacket had been behind her since she left the institute. First time she saw him that morning, she noted it. Second time, outside the coffee cart on Michigan, she filed it away. Third time, turning onto her street, she knew. She did not change her pace. She did not look back. She turned 1 block early and stopped in front of a newspaper stand, and she used the small compact mirror she kept in her bag to check behind her without checking behind her. He was still there, half a block back, not pretending to do anything except follow her. Nora looked at the newspapers without reading any headlines. Her phone rang. The number was not saved. She answered on the second ring. "The man in the gray jacket," said the voice. "Don't turn around. Walk to the coffee shop on the next corner and go inside." The voice was familiar. It took her exactly 2 seconds. "Callum," she said. "Walk," he said. He was already at the back corner when she came in, spine against the wall, facing the door. He had been there before she arrived, which meant he had not been following her. He had been following the person following her, and he had gotten there first. Nora sat down across from him, said nothing, waited. "He's been on you for 3 days," Callum said. "He's not mine." "Then whose is he?" "That's what I need to figure out. To do that, I need to understand why someone wants to know your movements." She looked at him steadily. "You've been watching me. I've been watching the person watching you. There's a difference." "Is there?" He did not answer immediately. A short pause. Not because he did not have an answer, because he was deciding how much of it to give her. Nora had been reading documents her whole professional life. She had learned to recognize the difference between the silence before a prepared answer and the silence before a true one. This was the second kind. She waited. "Your father worked for me," Callum said. "Not officially, not on paper. He mapped things that couldn't be mapped openly. Networks, transactions, evidence. For 20 years he documented everything I couldn't document without exposing myself or the people I protect." Nora did not say anything. "Someone found out what he was doing," Callum continued, "and he's gone. And 3 days ago, I watched his daughter walk out of a grocery store carrying a map written in his handwriting." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people doing calculations. Nora had one question. It was the only one that mattered to her right now. "Did you know someone was going to come for him?" Callum looked at her directly. "No. If I had known, he wouldn't be gone." She read his face, not with any special skill, just with the skill that comes from years of knowing what a true statement looks like as opposed to a prepared one. This was true. That did not mean she trusted him, but it opened a door wide enough to walk through. "The map is at my apartment," she said. "I didn't bring it out after the day I found it." "I know. You need me to read it for you?" "Yes. Then we need to understand each other better before I do that. How long have you been watching me?" Nora asked. Since the day your father died. 8 months. Yes. You never made contact. Because you didn't know who I was, and your father asked me not to approach you unless you were in real danger. And now I'm in real danger. Callum glanced briefly at his phone. The man outside has made 2 phone calls in the last 10 minutes, so yes. Nora looked at the door, then back at him. She thought about her father, Edmund Voss, who had spent 20 years being the most careful man she knew, who had never talked in detail about his work, who had redirected every question she asked about certain things with a patience so practiced it felt natural, who had taught her a code language disguised as a bedtime game, starting when she was 9, and she had loved every evening of it because he was there and he was paying attention, and it felt like something that belonged only to the two of them. She understood now what those evenings actually were. He had been preparing her without telling her he was preparing her. He had known, on some level, that there might come a time when she would need the key, and he had put it inside her the only way he could without also putting the danger inside her. She looked at Callum across the table. All right, she said. Tell me the rest. He told her about the network. Not everything. Enough. He had been operating an information system in Chicago for 11 years, built after his younger brother Danny disappeared. Information was the thing that protected people. Information was the thing that, when Danny needed it, had not been there in time. He had fixed that. Edmund Voss had been part of the network for 15 years. The cartographer who mapped what could not be mapped. The careful man who recorded everything in a language nobody else could read. Why are they watching me? Nora asked. Because the map can't be read without the person who knows the code. You are the code. Whoever is looking for what your father built, they need you to get to it. Or they need to remove me so I can't use it against them. Yes. She took that in. Who is they? I don't know yet, but I have 3 names from your father's map that I recognized when I saw it in your hands. One of those names has a lot to lose. Senator Mast, Nora said. Callum looked at her. A real look, not a managed one. You decoded it. 3 evenings. I know his symbol system. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your father taught you well. He taught me a game, Nora said. He just didn't tell me what game it was. Outside the window, the man in the gray jacket was still there. Back door, Callum said. I'll have someone redirect him. You're not going to hurt him. No, I'm going to have someone ask him questions he'll spend the next 2 hours answering. He'll be fine. He'll just be occupied. Nora stood up. I'll take you to the map. You don't have to do this today. You said I'm in real danger. Yes. Then I'd rather know what I'm in danger from. She picked up her coat. I'll take you to the map. We'll look at it together, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Callum stood. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, like a man recalibrating. All right, he said. They went out the back. Nora had expected one of 2 things. Something intimidating and expensive, all dark wood and leather, the kind of office that announces itself. Or something cold and functional, all white walls and locked doors, the kind of place that tells you nothing about the person inside it. She had not expected this. The office on the 14th floor of a plain building in the West Loop had no name on the door. Inside, it looked like a place where a person actually worked. The desk had good reading light. The bookshelves were organized by a system she recognized immediately as a real archival system, not decoration. There were papers on the desk that had been read and marked and returned to. The coffee cup near the window had been there long enough to leave a ring. And on the walls, maps. Chicago through different eras. 1871, the year of the fire, the grid redrawn in real time. 1920, when the city was reshaping itself again. 1968, the year of the convention, the year the streets meant something different than they had the year before. 2010, the modern version. And mixed in between them, maps in a different hand. Nora crossed the room before she meant to. She reached out and ran one finger along a set of lines she would have known anywhere. "That's my father's work," she said. 12 years of it, Callum said from behind her. "He updated them every quarter. He never showed me these. He was protecting you." She turned to look at him. From what, exactly? From knowing what he knew. It wasn't possible to know all of it and also be safe. He chose your safety. Nora turned back to the maps. She stood there for a moment and let herself do something she did not often allow herself to do, which was to feel the weight of it without immediately trying to organize it into something manageable. Her father had been here, had stood in this room, had hung these maps on these walls, and updated them every 3 months for 12 years, careful and methodical and thorough, and had never said a word about any of it. She understood why. She understood it completely. That did not make it easier. "All right," she said finally. "Let's look at the map." She spread it on the desk. It was easier in better light. The symbols her father had used were cleaner than she had thought in the dim of her kitchen, and some of the connections she had been uncertain about resolved themselves quickly now. She started talking, fast and precise, the way she talked when she was working, because when she was working, there was no reason to be slow. "The geographic symbols are the encoding layer," she said. "A river marker means flow of money. A boundary line means an agreement. An elevation mark means leverage. The higher the mark, the more significant. The dates are embedded in the scale bars." Callum listened. He did not interrupt. He did not write anything down, which she noticed. He was holding all of it in his head. "This cluster here," she said, pointing to the northeast section of the map. 3 names connected by double lines. That means recurring transactions. The dates run from 2008 to 2014. Callum looked at it. "The construction contracts," he said quietly. "The ones that went to the same 3 companies on every major city project for 6 years. You knew about that." "I knew the outline. I didn't know your father had the detail." "What kind of detail?" "The kind that tells you exactly who got paid, how much, and which official signed off each time." Nora traced the lines. "It's all here. Every transaction. Every name." They worked for 2 hours before either of them said anything that was not directly about the map. The rhythm of it was strange. She would identify a symbol or a cluster, and Callum would supply context without being asked, filling in what she could see but not interpret. When she needed to cross-reference a date against a location, she described what she was looking for, and twice he went directly to a specific folder in his cabinet, third drawer from the left, and pulled out exactly what she needed without searching. First time, she noticed but said nothing. Second time, she stopped. "You organize by the same system my father used," she said. "He taught me." She looked at him. This was not small. This was 15 years of 2 people trusting each other enough to share the same thinking. Not a professional relationship where information passed through formal channels. Something more than that. "When did he teach you?" she asked. "Year 3, Callum said. "I had a different system. He spent about a week looking at my filing before he told me, very politely, that it was going to get someone killed." Something about that almost made her smile. Almost. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. The picture was building. Not just relationships. Not just who knew who and when. Her father had been mapping evidence. Specific, documented, dated evidence. Every transaction, every meeting, every dollar that moved through the wrong channels for 20 years. It was not a record. It was a case file. The most thorough case file ever assembled, written in a language only one person alive could read. "He built a library," Nora said. "He built a bomb," Callum said quietly. She looked at him. "And he left the detonator with me." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Nora said, "Did you know what he was building?" Callum was quiet long enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. "I knew he was documenting. I didn't know the full scope." A pause. "If I had known the full scope—" He stopped. "You would have stopped him," she said. "I would have been more careful with him." Those were two different things. She understood the difference immediately. He was not saying he would have prevented the work. He was saying he would have protected the person doing it. And he had failed at that without knowing he was failing, which was its own particular kind of wound. Nora looked at the maps on the wall. All of her father's work, hung up carefully in chronological order, updated every 3 months for 12 years. There are more locations encoded in the second half, she said. I'll need another day to decode all of it. Take what you need. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I know. She picked up her coat. Your filing system, she said at the door without turning around. It's better organized than mine. She left before he could say anything. She walked home in the cold and thought about her father. He had spent 20 years mapping something enormous, and he had never told her. He had taught her the key and called it a game. He had protected her from the weight of knowing, and the weight had killed him in a parking lot 8 months ago. She thought about what it cost, carrying something that heavy alone. She thought about the careful way he had lived, the deliberate quiet of it, the version of love that looks like distance, when really it is a wall built around something precious. She understood it. She was doing the same thing with Jake. She turned onto her street and climbed the 3 flights to her apartment and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen looking at nothing in particular, and she decided that she was going to finish what her father started. Not for Callum Reyes, not for whatever justice looked like in a situation this complicated, for Edmund Voss, who had spent 20 years building something true. The second working day, Nora brought sandwiches. She stopped at the place on the corner of Adams, the one that made their own bread, and she got 2 of the same thing because she did not know what Callum ate and she did not feel like guessing. She put one in front of him when she arrived and sat down and opened the map. You don't have to, he started. I know, she said. Eat. He looked at the sandwich, looked at her, looked at the map. He ate. He didn't thank her with words, but there was something in how he ate that she recognized from her father. Deliberately, without rushing, like a person who has been alone long enough to know when a small thing is not actually a small thing. They worked through the morning. Nora decoded, Callum cross-referenced. They established a rhythm without discussing how to establish it. The way you sometimes do with another person when you find that you think in a similar sequence. She would reach a point where she needed historical context, and he would already be reaching for the right folder. He would identify a name she had not decoded yet, and she would find the corresponding symbol before he finished the sentence. An outside observer might have thought they had been working together for years. Nora thought about this while she was working, about how strange it was to find a person whose mind moved like yours. Most people you worked with, you had to account for the lag, the different pace, the different priorities, the different ways of organizing what was important. With Callum, there was almost none of that. She thought that would be a comfortable thing to feel. Instead, it made her cautious in a new way she had not expected. At 11 in the morning, her phone rang. Jake. The name on the screen. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. Hey, she said, and her voice did exactly what it always did, which was to become 3 degrees lighter than she actually felt. What's up? I was thinking, Jake said. Reading week is coming. I could come down to Chicago for a couple days. We could go to Kowalski's. Kowalski's was the Polish restaurant on the south side, the one their father had taken them to every Friday when they were kids, the one that still had the same menus, the same plastic booths, the same owner who had known their family for 20 years. Yeah, Nora said. Absolutely. Let me know the dates. You okay? I'm fine. Just working. You always say that. Because I'm always working. He laughed. She laughed with him, lighter than she felt, and they agreed on a weekend, and she hung up. The room was quiet for a moment. He doesn't know, Callum said. It was not a question. He's in his final year, thesis, scholarship application. A girlfriend and a life that has nothing to do with any of this. He's going to find out eventually. Eventually is not now. Callum looked at her with an expression that was not judgment, but was something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. Your father did the same thing. Protected everyone from knowing. Carried it alone. Is that a warning? An observation. The Voss family has a pattern. Nora looked down at the map. She knew he was right. She knew it in the way you know something you have been carefully not looking at, because looking at it would require a decision you are not ready to make. She also knew that knowing he was right and being ready to do anything about it were two separate things. Can we get back to the map? She said. He did. Late in the afternoon, she decoded a name she had not been expecting. Daniel. She asked Callum about it the way she would ask about any name in the map, without emphasis, just moving through the work. But she watched his face when she said it, and she saw the thing that happened there. My younger brother, he said. She waited. He told her. Flat and precise, the way you tell a story that used to cut and has since been worn smooth by repetition. Danny had been in finance. Smart and careful, like his brother, but in a different direction. He had been building a case against the same people Callum had been watching, and he had not told Callum because he was afraid Callum would stop him. He had disappeared on a Thursday morning. His car was found by the river 2 days later. There was no body. That was 11 years ago, Callum said. That was the year I started building the network. I decided I was never going to be the man who didn't know enough again. Nora looked down at the map. Her father had put Danny's name here. Her father had documented what had happened to Danny, quietly, as part of his work. For 11 years he had carried that knowledge alongside the man whose brother it was, and had never said so. My father mapped what happened to your brother, Nora said. All of it. It's here. Callum did not move. Both his hands were flat on the table. He was very still in the way of a person who has learned to keep themselves still when something is happening inside that they are not going to let out. Show me, he said. Nora stood up. She walked around to his side of the table. She laid the map between them, close enough that they were both looking at the same section, and she read it to him. Out loud, point by point, every name, every date, every connection her father had recorded. Not because he couldn't read it himself, because this was news about his brother, and it was 11 years old, and nobody should have to read something like that alone. She read all of it. When she finished, Callum was quiet for about 30 seconds. She stood close to him, not touching, just close. And the closeness was not about comfort exactly. It was about presence. The simple fact of another person in the room while something hard was being processed. He mapped everyone he lost, Callum said finally. His voice was even. Your father was very thorough. He loved people by documenting them, Nora said, and she had not thought before she said it. It was just true. It was the only language he had. Callum turned his head slightly and looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small rearrangement, the kind you see in a person when a thing they have been trying to understand suddenly makes sense. Yes, he said. I think that's exactly right. That evening, after Nora had gone, Callum sat in his office for a long time without turning on the lights. On the wall were Edmund's maps. All 12 years of them, updated every quarter, hung in careful order. All the work Edmund had done, in silence, over all those years. Callum thought about the fact that Edmund had known what happened to Danny and had never said so, had simply incorporated that knowledge into the record, had continued coming to this office and updating these maps and drinking the coffee that was always on the desk when he arrived, and had never said a word. Because telling Callum would have broken something, or because he understood that Callum was not ready to receive it, or because he simply believed that some grief needed to be held at a respectful distance until the person was ready to approach it. Callum sat in the dark for a long time and thought about Edmund Voss, who had known him for 15 years and had never stopped believing he was worth knowing. The next morning, Nora walked into the Hargrove Institute and knew immediately. She could not have explained it to someone who had never worked in an archive. It was the same instinct that tells you when a book has been moved and replaced, when a document has been handled and returned, when something that was arranged one way is now arranged slightly differently in a way that is technically correct but not quite yours. Someone had been in the archive. She walked the rows slowly. Nothing obvious, nothing taken. The cameras were intact, the locks were fine, the alarm log showed no breach. But a box in the Far East shelving unit had been opened and closed, and the papers inside were in a sequence that was almost right, just not quite the sequence she used. The Hyde Park donation box, the one that had held the map. They did not know the map was already gone. She called Callum from her office with the door closed. He arrived in 20 minutes. Watching him work in her space was instructive. He did not treat the archive like a crime scene to be processed. He moved through it the way she moved through it, which was to say he touched nothing he did not need to touch. He looked carefully at what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. And when he had formed a conclusion, he came and reported it to her like she was the one who was going to decide what happened next, which she was. This was her space. 3 people had access last night, he said. Your 2 colleagues who have keys, and 1 person who came through the loading dock. The loading dock has a camera. The loading dock camera has a 14-second blind spot every hour on the hour. Whoever came through knew that. Nora looked at him. You mapped my building. I map every building where people I'm responsible for spend time in. Am I someone you're responsible for? He met her gaze directly. You are now. Callum needed to talk to someone. He asked Nora if she wanted to come. She said yes. Not because he needed her there, because she needed to see him in his world before she gave him any more of her trust. They took a cab to River North. The address was an ordinary storefront, a dry cleaning shop, one of a small chain that had been operating on the north side for about 20 years. The woman who met them in the back office was named Lorraine Briggs, late 50s, silver hair cut short and practical, eyes that moved quickly and remembered everything they saw. She had the quality of someone who has survived a long time in a complicated world, not through force, but through understanding, better than anyone else, exactly what everything was actually worth. Nora watched Callum work. She had expected something harder, more threatening. She had a picture in her head of how a man like this operated, built from everything she had read and everything she thought she understood, and what she saw in that back room dismantled most of it. He did not threaten, not once, not even adjacent to it. He asked questions, but the questions were framed in a specific way, a way that made clear he already knew the shape of the answer and was simply giving Lorraine the opportunity to fill in the detail correctly. The power in the room was not the power of someone who could hurt you. It was the power of someone who already knew enough about you that making an enemy of them would be genuinely costly. It was a very different thing. It was, she realized, the same kind of power her father had held, in a quieter version. The power of the person who has been paying attention. Lorraine looked at Nora. Edmund's daughter. You knew my father. Everyone who mattered knew Edmund. She looked back at Callum. The person you're looking for isn't small. They're working for someone who has been very quiet for a very long time, and they do not want the archive. She looked at Nora again. They want her. Why me? Nora asked in the cab on the way back. Because the map is useless without the person who can read it, Callum said. Anyone can find a piece of paper. They can't decode it. You're the key. That makes me a target. Yes. That also makes me leverage. Yes. She looked out the window at the city going by. Chicago in late November, gray and cold and precise in the way cold cities are, everything stripped back to its essential geometry. There's something else, Callum said. She looked at him. Your father didn't leave the map in the archive by accident. He arranged for that specific box to be donated. To your archive, on your shift. She was quiet for a moment. He knew he was going to die. He knew someone was eventually coming for him. He didn't know when, so he built a fail-safe. Me. You. He trusted you to find it, read it, and know what to do with it. Nora looked out this window again. She thought about the bedtime puzzle game. She thought about 3 years of evenings, age 9 through 12, sitting at the kitchen table with her father while he drew small maps and watched her decode them. She had been so pleased with herself. She had thought it was a game they had invented together. He had been giving her a key and not telling her what it unlocked. He could have burned all of it, she said. Yes. He chose not to. He chose you, Callum said. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones before. Something had settled. He walked her to the corner near her apartment. When this is over, she said, what happens to you? He did not answer right away. That's the first time you've used my name, he said. Answer the question. I don't know yet. A beat. Honestly, she nodded once. Tomorrow, she said. I want to finish decoding the second half of the map. I think there are at least 4 more locations. I'll be there at 9. She walked toward her building. He stayed at the corner until she was inside. He stood there for a moment after, in the November cold, and he thought about the way she had asked that question. Not rhetorically, not as pressure, as genuine inquiry, like a person who wanted to know the real answer. He had not had someone ask him that in a very long time. He walked back to his car and did not answer the question for himself either, because he had not been in the habit of asking it, and he was not yet sure what it would mean to start. The last section of the map took them most of a day. Edmund had been thorough here in a way he had not been in earlier sections, layering the encoding 3 times on some of the most sensitive material. Nora worked through it methodically, the same way she worked through a difficult archival problem, which was to say she started with what she knew for certain and built outward from there, never guessing, always verifying against the internal logic of the symbol system. Callum supplied context without being asked. By mid-afternoon, they had the full picture. 7 locations. 6 in Chicago, 1 in Boston. Jake's library, Nora said. Yes. She looked at that part of the map for a long time. Her father had put a piece of evidence in a building 1 block from where Jake studied. Had put it there, presumably, years before Jake enrolled. Had known, with the careful long-range thinking that characterized everything Edmund did, that the building would still be there, that the access would be possible, that someone who knew where to look would be able to find it. He planned all of this, she said. Yes. Every piece, every location, the timeline, every detail. She sat back. Jake doesn't know it's there. No. The question of whether she had to tell Jake now hung in the space between them. Neither of them said it out loud, but it was there. Callum ordered food, the Polish restaurant 2 blocks east. He knew she had not eaten since that morning, not because he was tracking it, just because she had that quality that certain focused people have of forgetting to stop. He had ordered the same thing he would have ordered for himself and put it in front of her without making an event of it. They ate at the work table. The map was folded away for the first time in days. There was nothing left to decode. The work was done in the sense that they now knew what they were dealing with, and what came next would require a different kind of work entirely. Neither of them moved to leave. Where did you learn to read maps? Nora asked. He told her about a library in Pilsen when he was a kid. An old man named Arthur Walsh, a retired surveyor who came in every Saturday and occupied the same chair and talked to anyone who would listen. Arthur believed that maps were the only truly honest document, that a map, unlike a contract or a testimony or a newspaper article, simply recorded what was there. It did not argue. It did not persuade. It said, here is a river, here is a road, here is where the land rises. The facts did not have an agenda. He used to say, Callum said, show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go at night. Show me that, and I'll tell you everything about them that their words will never say. My father used to say something like that, Nora said. I know, he quoted Arthur often. You knew each other a long time. 15 years, He came to me the week Danny disappeared. He was the only person outside my organization who knew to come to me. Why you? Callum looked at the table for a moment. He said he had been watching me map people for years. He said I was the only one who mapped them to protect them, not to use them. Is that still true? He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He did not reach for the easy answer. It used to be cleaner, he said. I started out protecting people. Then somewhere along the way I became something that people needed protecting from. And your father kept mapping me after that. I never fully understood why. Because he thought you could come back. Callum looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. He mapped you for 15 years, Nora said. He didn't map things he had given up on. The call came at 9 in the evening. Callum's phone. He looked at the screen and something changed in his posture, a small shift that Nora had learned to read over the last several days as the shift from thinking to moving. He answered and spoke in short sentences. The person on the other end was feeding him information quickly. One of his people was in a difficult situation, something that needed managing in the next hour. He was on his feet, moving around the office, making 3 calls in sequence, brief and exact, his voice the same temperature throughout, as if urgency and calm were not opposites in his world, but simply the same state under different circumstances. Nora watched. She watched him look up at her, twice, in the middle of those calls, not to check on her. She understood, without being able to fully explain how, that he was using her presence in the room the way you use a fixed point when you're disoriented. Something to orient toward. When it was over, he stood at the window. She stood beside him. I've been doing this alone for 11 years, he said quietly. It's easier alone, fewer considerations. But, she said, but tonight I looked up and you were in the room, and something in the decision got clearer. They stood looking at Chicago through the glass, the city at night, all those lights and all those windows, all those people inside doing all their private things. I think I know what my father was trying to say, Nora said. Not just with the map. To me, specifically. Tell me. He was saying, this is the world. Don't look away from it, and don't face it alone. It was Callum who moved first. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill. Slowly. The way you place something down when you don't want to make a sound. She did not pull away. They stood like that and looked at Chicago, hand in hand. No words. The city going about its business below them, indifferent and enormous and ongoing. And them up here in this office with all of Edmund Voss's maps on the walls, standing in the particular quiet that 2 people can make when they have stopped pretending. Later, Nora would think about this moment the way you think about the last warm evening of autumn. You are not aware, while you're in it, that it is the last one. You only know that afterward. When the cold has come and stayed and you look back and think, that was it. That was the last good evening. And I did not know it while I was standing in it. Marcus Webb contacted her on a Thursday. She almost did not recognize the name. It appeared in the map in a section she had decoded early on, one of the older entries, a connection to her father that predated most of what she had found. Former colleague. The role had been ambiguous in the encoding, which meant her father had deliberately made it ambiguous, which usually meant the relationship was complicated. Webb wanted to meet. Alone. No Callum. He said, I knew your father for 30 years. I know something you need to hear before you go any further with this. If you come with Callum present, I won't tell you. She thought about it for most of that morning. Then she went. A park bench near the lake. Webb was older than she had pictured from the map reference. Late 60s, tired in a way that went past the physical. But his eyes were sharp, the sharpness of a man who had been paying attention to difficult things for a long time and had not been able to stop. Callum knew someone was coming for your father, Webb said. He said it flat, the way you say a fact you have been carrying for a while and are relieved to finally set down. Not as a suspicion. He knew. 1 week before Edmund died, Callum received specific threat intelligence, a specific name, a specific timeline. He did not warn Edmund. Nora sat with that. Why not? She asked. Webb did not answer quickly enough. Where did you get this information? She said. Webb looked away. You are either telling me the truth, Nora said, or you are the person who killed him. Those are the only two options I'm willing to consider right now. Which is it? It's not that simple. Yes, she said. It is. She stood up. Nora, I need to think about this. She walked back to the street and stood at the corner in the cold for about 3 minutes, doing exactly what she told him she needed to do, which was think. She thought about the 8 months since her father's death. She thought about Callum in his office with all of Edmund's maps on the walls. She thought about the way he had said, I would have been more careful with him, and the weight she had heard in those words. She thought about the gap between I didn't know and I didn't know in time. Then she walked to West's Loop. She went straight in. No pause at the door. No waiting for him to look up from whatever he was doing. She walked in, and she stood there, and she asked the question before she had time to find a gentler version of it. Did you know someone was going to come for my father? 1 week before he died? Callum looked at her. He did not answer immediately. The pause was short, maybe 2 seconds. But Nora had been reading silences in documents her entire professional life, and she read this one. Tell me, she said. My information said the threat was targeting me, not him. But he died, not you. Yes. And you've known that for 8 months. Yes. She took that in, let the full weight of it land. You let me spend a week in this room, reading his maps, telling you about Jake, telling you things I have never told anyone. The whole time, you knew you might have been able to save him. I didn't know. You knew enough to wonder, and you didn't tell me. He did not deny it. He did not reach for the prepared version of events. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided to stop managing something. I was afraid that if you knew, he said, you would stop, and I needed you to finish the map. Nora stood very still. This was not a beautiful admission. There was nothing strategic about it, nothing that made him look better than he was. It was simply the truth, said plainly, and it was worse than any justification would have been because it did not ask her to understand. It only asked her to know. At least that's honest, she said. His phone went off 2 minutes later. Senator Mast, Boston, Jake. She watched Callum's face change. She watched him process the information and make the calls, and deploy whatever resource he had available in Boston to intercept the situation. It took 4 minutes. Jake was safe. She watched him do all of it correctly. Fast and careful and effective. The man who was very good at knowing things before they became problems, doing exactly what he was good at, protecting the younger brother of the man whose father he had not protected in time. She picked up her coat. Jake is safe, she said. That's what matters right now. Nora, I should have told you. He said it quietly. Not an apology exactly, a statement of fact. Yes, she said. She paused at the door, did not turn around. The map is decoded. You have everything you need. You don't need me for the rest of it. That's not... Good night, Callum. She closed the door behind her. She walked home in the dark. It was cold the way Chicago in late November is cold, which is to say, it was sincere about it. She walked with her hands in her pockets, and she did not think about anything except walking. Left foot, right foot, 1 block, and then the next. At home she made tea, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the alley below. A cat crossed between the dumpsters and disappeared. She thought about her father. She thought about the fact that he had known Callum for 15 years, had known his faults as well as his strengths, had continued working with him and trusting him and updating his maps on the walls of that office every quarter for 15 years. She thought about what that said. Not about Callum. About Edmund. Her father had not been naive. He had never been naive. He had been, in every way she could measure, one of the most clear-eyed people she had ever known. He had seen Callum clearly, including the parts that were not clean, and he had chosen to continue. She did not know yet what to do with that. She drank her tea. She went to bed. She did not call Callum. She did not go in the next day. She needed to think, and she needed to do it without anyone else in the room. She stayed home for 3 days. She did not stop working. That was not in her. But she worked alone, the way she had worked for 8 months before any of this, sitting at her kitchen table with the decoded notes, and the Chicago wall map, and the small notebook with pencil entries. She traced the 7 locations on her map. 6 in Chicago, 1 in Boston. She was not going to retrieve any of the evidence yet. She understood that. But she wanted to know the full geography of it, the shape of what her father had built, before she made any decisions about what to do next. She read her decoded notes from the beginning, and in reading them again, slowly, without the pressure of Callum's presence in the room, she saw something she had been moving past quickly, because there was always more to decode. Her father had documented Callum, not as an adversary, not as a target, but as a subject of careful, ongoing 15-year observation, the way her father documented everything he believed was worth tracking. Every year, consistent entries. The things Callum had done that were wrong, the things he had done that were right. The trajectory of a man that her father had watched and recorded and continued to believe in, the evidence in that record growing complicated over time, and her father continuing anyway. Edmund Voss had believed for 15 years that Callum Reyes was worth the trouble of knowing. She sat with that for a long time. Jake called that evening. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "I had a weird thing happen. There was a guy outside my building, not doing anything, just standing there. He was there for like 2 hours and then gone. Felt off." "Yeah," Nora said. "I know. That was someone making sure you were okay. He's gone now." A pause. "What's going on?" She had been sitting here for 3 days thinking about patterns, about her father carrying everything alone, about herself carrying everything alone, about Jake, 24, and finishing his last year, a girlfriend, a thesis, a life that Nora had been shielding from information he might actually need. Dad was doing dangerous work, she said. For a long time, he believed in what he was doing, and he loved us by keeping us out of it. That was the best way he knew how to love us. Jake was very quiet. "He's gone," Nora said, "and he left some of it to me to finish. And I think I might need your help with one part of it. The Boston part." Another pause. "Dad would have told me eventually," Jake said. Not accusing, just stating. "Yes, I think he would have." "Okay." Jake's voice was even. He was, Nora thought, more her father's son than she had recognized. "Tell me what you need." Callum spent those same 3 days in a way that was different from how he had ever spent 3 days before, which was to say he spent them doing his actual work, managing the information network, dealing with the 3 separate situations that required his attention that week, and all of it felt less important than usual in a way he did not have a framework to categorize. He met with Marcus Webb on the second day. He went to meet him not to threaten him and not to punish him for going to Nora. He went because Webb had done something useful, which was to give Nora a true piece of information even though it was damaging to Callum, and that act was one Callum could recognize. "She needed to know," Webb said, when Callum sat down across from him in the diner near USC. "Yes," Callum said, "you were going to tell her eventually." "I don't know." Webb looked at him with the steady exhaustion of a man who has been paying attention to difficult things for 30 years and is tired of watching people make the same mistakes. "Edmund trusted you with his daughter's safety, not with his daughter. You understand that?" "Yes." "Then act like it." Callum went back to his office that evening. He sat at his desk for a long time in the quiet. Then he opened a new file on his computer, typed the name, Nora Voss, looked at it, then he closed it without typing anything else, did not delete it, left it empty. In 11 years, he had a file on every person who mattered to him, every person he was responsible for, every person whose safety depended on him knowing things in advance. It was the system. It was how he prevented the next Danny. He had not opened a file on Nora. He had told himself it was because she was temporary, because she would decode the map and the map would be finished, and she would go back to being Edmund's daughter at the archive, her life restored to its original shape. He understood now that was not true. That had not been true since the grocery store. He left the file empty. He thought about Edmund, who had mapped him for 15 years and had never stopped. He thought about what Nora had said. Because he thought you could come back. He had not answered that. He still did not know the answer. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to sit with not knowing. On the third day, Senator Mast moved. Not against Nora directly. Mast was too careful for that. He used his position on a state oversight committee to send a formal letter to the Hargrove Institute requesting that any recent materials related to certain named individuals be made available for a federal review. The letter was perfectly legal. The timing, 8 days after someone had searched the archive at night, was not coincidental. Callum spent 6 hours on that day reaching out to 3 journalists, not feeding them a story, feeding them a question, the right question, with enough background that any competent reporter would know where to start looking. He did not tell any of them what he knew. He gave each of them a thread. That evening, Mast received a call from his chief of staff. 2 reporters had called his office with questions about the Oversight Committee letter. A third had published a brief item, noting that the letter had been sent 8 days after reports of unusual activity near the Hargrove Institute. The letter was quietly withdrawn the next morning. It was not a solution, it was a delay. But it was 3 weeks of breathing room, and 3 weeks was enough time to finish what Edmund had started. Callum stood at his window and looked at the city. He thought about what it had cost him, working alone for 11 years. He thought it might be time to find out what the alternative felt like. Day 7. Morning. Nora did not call ahead. She walked through the lobby of the West Loop building, nodded at Phil, who opened the door and did not say a word, just nodded back with the small nod of a man acknowledging someone he has decided is worth the space she occupies. Callum was at his desk when she came in. He set his book down when he saw her. Not quickly. Slowly, like something he did not want to make a sound. Nora stood at the door. "I have 2 conditions," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me." "First, any information that affects my safety or Jake's, I hear it immediately. Not after you've decided whether it serves the mission." "Agreed." "Second, when this is over, when Mast is dealt with and the evidence is placed, I want to know everything, not a summary. Everything. I'll decide what I do with it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a simple ask." "I know. It's what I need." "Agreed." She stood there a moment longer. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying I understand why you made the choice you made. I think you were wrong. I think you know you were wrong." "Yes," he said. "That's enough to keep going." She took off her coat and set it on the chair, the same chair she always used. "Show me where we are." They worked differently after that. Not worse. Differently. There was a small, careful distance kept, a deliberate thing, something both of them maintained without discussing it, like a rule that did not need to be stated. But there was also more honesty in the room. Because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to calculate. The thing that had been hidden was out now, and they were both looking at it with their eyes open. Callum asked her opinion on how to approach one of the evidence retrieval locations. He did not need her opinion. He had been navigating situations like this for years. But he asked, and he listened to her answer, and he adjusted the plan based on what she said. On his desk there was a new book, History of Cartography in the American Midwest, focusing on the period between 1980 and 2005, Edmund's years. Nora saw it, said nothing, but something small shifted in her chest, something she could not have named exactly, like a door that had been almost closed moving slightly more toward open. He was trying to understand her father. Not to use the knowledge. To understand. The first evidence retrieval was in a building in Pilsen. A storage unit in the basement of a commercial building that had changed hands 4 times in 20 years, each time with the unit passing along in the paperwork as part of the property agreement. Edmund had been clever about this. He had structured it so the unit was legally attached to the building, not to any individual, which meant it had survived 3 ownership changes without attracting attention. They went together. Outside the building, they picked up a tail, not obvious, not dramatic, just a car that had been behind them for 6 blocks and made the same turn 3 times. Callum was already planning the approach when Nora said, "Back entrance. There's a service alley on the east side that connects to the next street." He looked at her. "I researched the building when I decoded the location," she said. "City records. Building permits from 2009. There's a secondary access route that wasn't in the original plans, added during a renovation." He changed course without a word. They used the service alley. The car had no way to follow. They retrieved the unit key from behind the second loose brick on the east interior wall, exactly where Edmund had mapped it, and they were in and out in 11 minutes. On the street after, heading back to a cab, Callum said, "You were right." "I know." "About the alley." "I know." He looked at her, and he said quietly, "You would have made a good cartographer." It was not a compliment about a skill. It was the compliment that meant, "You think the way he thought." He was right to trust you with this. Nora did not say anything, but she did not look away. That night, they sat in the office after the work was done. No map on the table. It was the first time in almost 2 weeks that they had been in this room together without the map as the center of things. "My father left a note," Nora said. Callum waited. "Not encoded in the map. A separate note, written on paper, left in my father's safety deposit box. The bank held it according to his instructions and released it to me last week." She had been carrying this for 7 days without knowing what to do with it. "I'll tell you what it said." "Okay." He said, "The most important thing I ever mapped was the people worth protecting." He listed 3 names. She paused. "Mine, Jake's." Another pause. "Yours." Callum did not move. "He listed you," she said. "He listed me. Before any of this happened, before I decoded the map, before we met, before any of the last 2 weeks, he listed you in a note written to his daughter. He listed you among the people worth protecting." Callum looked down at his hands. She understood what he was sitting with. This note did not absolve him of the choice he had made. Edmund had written it before that choice happened, but it said something about what Edmund had seen in him, what Edmund had believed was there, and that belief had been consistent enough and strong enough to put in writing and leave behind. "He wasn't saying you're perfect," Nora said. "He was saying you're worth it. Those aren't the same thing." "No, they're not." She looked at him steadily. "But I think he was right about both." The room was quiet. Outside, Chicago continued to be Chicago, cold and enormous and ongoing. Inside, in the space between 2 people who had stopped performing for each other somewhere in the last 2 weeks, there was a particular kind of silence. The kind that only exists when both people have decided, without announcing the decision, that they are in this together. Jake found the Boston piece on a Tuesday. Nora had called him the Sunday before and given him exact instructions: the library, the third-floor reading room, the reference section, the specific shelf, the book with a specific call number that her father had placed there years before Jake ever enrolled. Jake had texted her the night before. "I found it. It's what you said it would be." He had taken photographs of everything, uploaded them to a secure folder, sent her the link. She sat with all 7 pieces spread across Callum's desk on a Wednesday morning and felt the full weight of it for the first time. 20 years. Every transaction, every meeting, every name. The complete record of how a specific kind of power had been built in Chicago, layer by layer, over 2 decades. Her father had done this alone. "He didn't build this to destroy anyone," Nora said. Callum was on the other side of the desk. He had been quiet for a while, looking at what they had assembled. "No," he said. He built it because he believed the record mattered, that some things needed to be documented whether or not anything happened immediately, that the truth has value independent of whether it changes anything right now. He was an archivist at heart, Callum said. Even in this, he was preserving. Yes. She looked at everything on the table. Where does this go? Callum was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. He had been thinking about this, she could tell, for longer than this morning. Not law enforcement, he said. Most of it would get buried. Not the press directly. They'd be targeted and the whole thing would become a story about the fight over the story. He looked at her. The archive, he said. She looked at him. Your archive. The Hargrove Institute. Historical record, properly catalogued, sealed for 25 years under restricted access protocols, in a form that is legally protected as historical scholarship, with the full provenance documented. Nora thought about her father, about the specific box of donated materials that had arrived at the archive on a Tuesday evening, placed on her table during her shift, containing a map written in a language only she could read. He planned this, she said. Every detail. The archive was always the destination. He just needed you to be the one who brought it there. She looked at everything on the table. 20 years of her father's careful work, the most important thing he ever built. I'll need 3 days to prepare the documentation, she said. If we do this right, it needs a proper archival record, chain of custody, provenance notes, access restrictions. However long it needs. And I need to be the one who files it, under my professional authority. Of course. She started organizing the papers. Callum watched her for a moment, this woman who had inherited her father's hands and her father's eyes and her father's absolute faith in the importance of keeping things correctly. Then he picked up his phone and called Mast. The meeting was in a downtown hotel, a lobby bar, public, which was what Mast had requested, believing that public spaces protected him. Callum let him believe that. He sat across from Mast and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. A summary, 1 page, enough to make clear that what existed was comprehensive, specific, and documented. This is going into a historical archive, Callum said, sealed for 25 years. By then, either the landscape has changed enough that it no longer matters, or it matters enough that it should be found. Mast looked at the paper. He was very controlled. A man who had spent his career maintaining control in rooms where most people were less skilled at it than he was. And if I move against, he started. If you move against anyone connected to this, Callum said, it goes out, all of it, tomorrow, to the same 3 journalists who called your office last week, and to 4 others who have been asking questions about you for different reasons that you are also aware of. You'd expose yourself. Callum looked at him steadily. Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something to protect people, he said. I'm in the business of honoring that. What I expose doesn't matter as much as what I protect. Mast was quiet. Then he stood up. He picked up the single sheet of paper and looked at it one more time. Then he set it back down on the table and walked out of the hotel lobby without looking back. Callum sat there for a moment. He thought about Edmund. About 15 years of maps updated every quarter. About a man who had documented everything, who had believed that the careful record of true things was its own form of power, its own form of protection. He thought about a woman who had inherited that belief completely. He stood up and left the hotel. Nora was alone in the archive that night. It was late. The building was quiet. She had been here since 7, working through the documentation for the collection, giving everything its proper record. Chain of custody, provenance notes, access restriction protocols, clearly written and signed. She heard the door. Callum came through the security entrance with the access code she had given him the week before. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on her desk. It's done? She asked. Mast won't move. The materials are safe. You have time to complete the documentation. She nodded. Tell me how it went. He told her. Everything, including what he had said. She listened all the way through. You meant it, she said. Yes, that's different. Yes. He said it without embellishment, without looking for her reaction. Just, yes, it's different, it's true. You can take that as what it is. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the shelving unit on the east wall. Third section from the left, second shelf from the top. A small flat box, plain brown, labeled under her employee number, with a cataloging note she had placed there herself last week, following her father's instructions. She brought it to the desk. His journals, she said. 20 years. Everything he thought and observed that he didn't encode in the maps. She pushed it toward Callum. He left access notes. Your name, not mine. Callum looked at the box. He cataloged them for you, Nora said. He knew you'd be here. Callum was quiet for a long moment. He mapped everything, he said. Everything worth keeping. He reached out and put his hand on the box. Did not open it. Just rested his hand there, the way you rest your hand on something that matters, to confirm it is real. Later they were both standing at the archive door, coats on, the work done for the evening. What do you want? Callum asked. After this. After this meaning. After the archive. After all of it. She thought about it honestly. I want to keep doing this, she said. Cataloging things, reading patterns, finding what people leave behind and making sure it doesn't get lost. She paused. You? He thought about it honestly. I want to stop knowing everything about everyone before it happens, he said. I want to stand somewhere I don't know what comes next and find out. That sounds terrifying for you. Yes. There's a research consultation position at the Institute, she said. Someone who can read patterns in historical records and connect them to present context, 3 days a week. He looked at her. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice if you don't. He moved closer to her, slowly. He put his hand against her face the way she had touched her father's maps on that first day in this office, with the tips of his fingers, as if verifying that something was real. I'll show up, he said. 6 months later. The archive in spring looked different than the archive in November. The light was different. It came through the high windows at a different angle and hit the shelving in a way that made everything look documented, considered, permanent in the good sense. Nora's desk was the same desk it had always been. The same reading lamp, the same system of organized folders, the same cup of tea cooling on the left side because she always forgot to drink it before it went cold. The desk beside hers was newer, smaller. It held a black leather notebook, a quality pen, and nothing else. No computer, no phone in view. Callum sat there on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Friday afternoons, and he worked on the project they had started together 4 months ago, a comprehensive historical record of Chicago across 5 decades, the way the city changed, the way power moved through it, the way the people inside it adapted and survived and occasionally changed things. It was not the kind of work he had done before. It was slower, more patient, more dependent on other people and their records and their careful preservation of small true things. He was, to his own mild surprise, good at it. Jake came down one Saturday in April. He met Callum over dinner at Kowalski's, the Polish place on the south side, the same plastic booths and the same menu, and the owner who had known the Voss family for 2 decades. Jake shook Callum's hand and looked at him with the frank assessment of a younger person evaluating someone important to his sister. Then he sat down and ordered the kielbasa and started talking about his dissertation research, which covered the economics of Midwestern industrial cities in the 1970s, and Callum asked 2 questions that were better than the questions most people in Jake's academic program asked. Jake looked at his sister across the table with an expression that said several things at once. Nora looked back at him and said nothing. Later, outside while Callum paid the check, Jake pulled her to one side. He's sort of terrifying, he said. Sort of, Nora agreed. Dad would have liked him. She did not say anything to that. She did not disagree. Phil Dorsey retired at the end of April, 42 years total between the Hargrove Institute and the building in the West Loop, and at the small gathering in the lobby, he shook Callum's hand. Not the way he had shaken his hand before. Not the handshake between a security professional and the person who paid his salary. A real handshake, person to person. The handshake of a man acknowledging someone who turned out to be worth the space they take up. Callum shook his hand back with the same quality in it. Nora watched this from across the room and thought about her father, who had spent 15 years believing that people could become more than their worst decisions if someone would keep paying attention. On a Thursday evening in late May, Nora stayed late in the archive. She often did. It was her habit and her preference, those quiet hours after the institute closed, when it was just her and the 34,000 documents and the particular quality of silence that an archive holds. All that accumulated human record, all those things people had thought were worth keeping, held carefully in a building designed for exactly that purpose. She walked the rows, turning off lights, one hand trailing along the edges of the shelving as she went, past the Chicago historical records, past the donated collections from Hyde Park and Pilsen and Bridgeport, past the new section at the back of the building, the sealed collection with restricted access and a 25-year hold date, the collection she had catalogued herself and filed under her professional authority, the most important thing her father had ever built, properly kept. Callum was at the front door with his coat when she reached the last row, waiting the way he always waited, without impatience, without checking his phone, just there. She turned off the last light. She walked toward him through the dark. She knew the way. This was her space. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." They walked out together. The door closed behind them with the sound that archive doors make, solid and certain, everything inside correctly held. Her father had spent 20 years mapping what mattered. She understood now what he had been working toward. Not an archive of damage, not a weapon, a record of what was worth protecting. The true shape of things, held carefully, preserved correctly, available to whoever needed it at whatever point it was needed. She had his hands, his habit of noticing, his particular faith that the right things, properly kept, would outlast the wrong ones. She carried that forward. She carried it alongside someone who had spent 11 years knowing everything and was learning, slowly and genuinely, that the things most worth knowing were the ones you let yourself not know in advance. The ones that surprised you. The ones you had not charted. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's work. It held, in a sealed box, in the restricted collection, 20 years of evidence that might matter very much in 25 years, or might matter not at all, and either way had been correctly preserved. And it held, in no file and no catalog, in no system and no record that anyone would ever find, the particular kind of quiet that settles into a space when two people have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. That, too, was worth keeping. That, too, was the cartographer's daughter's work. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
Before we close, I want to stay with this story for just a moment longer, because this was never really about a mafia boss and a woman who fainted in a grocery store. That was just the door. What was behind it is something much more worth your time. This story is about the price of silence. Edmund Voss spent 20 years building the most important work of his life, and he did it completely alone. He told himself it was to protect his daughter. And maybe it was. But here is the harder truth. The people we love the most are often the ones we trust the least with the weight of what we actually carry. Not because we doubt them, because we cannot bear the thought of them being burdened by what we know. That is not protection. That is a decision made for someone else about what they are capable of handling. Nora was capable of everything. She had always been capable of everything. Edmund knew that. He just could not bring himself to let her prove it while he was still alive to see it. And so she found out anyway, alone, 8 months after he was gone. The first lesson this story teaches is this: the people who love you deserve the truth about your life, not the comfortable version, the real one. Because when you carry everything alone to spare them, you are not giving them a gift. You are taking something from them, the chance to stand beside you, the chance to choose. The second lesson belongs to Callum. Here was a man who had built his entire identity around knowing, around the belief that information is armor, that if you know enough, nothing can touch you, nothing can be lost. And then he made one calculation, one decision to withhold the truth from Nora because he needed her to stay, because the mission mattered, because he told himself the timing was not right. His brilliant mind, his 11 years of careful work, his entire system, and none of it protected him from the oldest human mistake there is: choosing what is useful over what is right. Intelligence without integrity is not wisdom. It is just a more sophisticated way to fail the people who matter. But here is what I want you to take away from all of it. Both of these men, Edmund and Callum, were not bad people. They were people who loved deeply and protected fiercely and still got it wrong in the same fundamental way. They confused control with care. The moment Callum put that file on his computer and then left it empty, the moment he chose not to know in advance, that was the bravest thing he did in the entire story. Not any phone call, not any confrontation. That small, quiet act of choosing uncertainty over control. Because real strength is not the absence of fear. Real strength is deciding that another person's truth matters more than your own comfort. That is what Edmund tried to say with every map he ever drew. That is what Nora understood when she finally read them. And that is what every person listening to this story right now already knows somewhere deep inside themselves. They just needed someone to say it out loud. Some things, when properly kept, outlast everything that tries to bury them. The truth is one of them.